Imagine standing on Mount Sinai while the mountain is covered in cloud and fire. Below you is a nation that has only recently escaped slavery. Behind them lies Egypt, Pharaoh, the plagues, and the night of Passover. Ahead lies a wilderness they do not yet understand, and a covenant they have not yet learned how to keep. But according to one ancient Jewish book, Moses was receiving something on that mountain beyond the commandments most readers associate with Sinai. He was being shown history itself, not simply what had happened, but when it had happened. Creation, Eden, Cain and Abel, Enoch, the mysterious beings who descended before the flood, Noah, Babel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Egypt, generation after generation, arranged into weeks of years and cycles of jubilees, as though human history were not moving randomly across time, but according to a pattern already known in heaven. That book is known today as the Book of Jubilees, and it presents one of the most extraordinary retellings of the world of Genesis ever preserved from ancient Judaism. For many modern Christians, the title is unfamiliar. Others may have encountered Jubilees through discussions about the Watchers, the Nephilim, ancient calendars, forbidden books, or the Dead Sea Scrolls. Online, it is sometimes surrounded by claims far more dramatic than the surviving text can support. So before we enter its world, one distinction must remain clear from the beginning. The Book of Jubilees is not simply another version of Genesis that can be quoted as though every detail appears in the biblical text. Genesis says what Genesis says. Exodus says what Exodus says. Jubilees is an ancient Jewish work that retells, expands, interprets, and sometimes reshapes those stories. That difference matters, because when Jubilees introduces details about angels, heavenly tablets, precise dates, patriarchal laws, supernatural spirits, or events that Genesis never describes, we must not silently place those details back into the Bible and pretend they were there all along. Yet dismissing Jubilees as meaningless would be another mistake. The book opens a window into the way some ancient Jewish readers interpreted the Torah during the centuries before the New Testament era. It shows us a world in which biblical history, covenant worship, angels, festivals, purity, and even the calendar were woven together into one enormous vision of divine order. And the strange thing is that the book does not begin where Genesis begins. It begins where Exodus leads us, at Sinai. Israel has left Egypt. The people have crossed into the wilderness. Moses ascends the mountain. In the canonical book of Exodus, Mount Sinai becomes the place where God establishes covenant with Israel and gives commandments that will shape the nation's life. Jubilees takes that familiar scene and makes an extraordinary literary claim. It presents the history that follows as revelation given to Moses on the mountain. In the opening chapter, Moses is summoned upward. The glory of God rests upon Sinai. The cloud covers the mountain. Moses remains there for 40 days and 40 nights. So far, the scene echoes Exodus. But then, Jubilees expands the moment. Moses is instructed concerning what the book calls the earlier and later history of the division of the days, the story of generations, years, weeks of years, and jubilees. The angel of the presence becomes the narrator through whom this history is written for Moses. And suddenly, Sinai becomes more than the place where Israel receives commandments. It becomes the vantage point from which the entire past is retold. That framing changes the way the book wants its audience to understand Genesis. Creation is not merely ancient history. Abraham is not merely a wandering patriarch. Passover is not merely a future event that will occur in Egypt. The Sabbath is not merely one commandment among many. All of these things belong in the worldview of Jubilees to an order that reaches deeper than Moses' own generation. The book wants the reader to believe that Israel's sacred life is connected to the structure of creation itself. This is why time matters so much. Even the title points toward it. A biblical jubilee is connected with a cycle of 7 periods of 7 years, 49 years after which the 50th year has special significance in Leviticus. Jubilees takes the language of these cycles and uses it to organize history. Years do not simply pass, they are counted. Generations do not simply rise and disappear, they are positioned. Events do not float loosely in an undefined past, they are placed within sacred chronology. To a modern reader, that can feel obsessive. Why care exactly when a marriage occurred? Why identify the year of a birth? Why organize patriarchal history into repeating numerical patterns? Why connect festivals to events that happened generations before Moses? Because for the author of Jubilees, correct time is connected to correct worship, and correct worship is connected to covenant faithfulness. That conviction will eventually lead us into one of the most controversial features of the book, its calendar. But that argument comes later. First, the angel takes Moses backward, back before Egypt, before Jacob, before Abraham, before Noah, before Enoch, back to the beginning. And here the differences between Genesis and Jubilees begin appearing almost immediately. Genesis opens majestically and simply: God creates the heavens and the earth. Light is separated from darkness. Waters are divided. Dry land appears. Vegetation rises. The heavenly lights are appointed. Living creatures fill sea, sky, and land. Humanity is created in God's image. Then comes the 7th day. God rests. Jubilees follows that broad structure, but it adds another layer. Its creation account describes angelic beings as part of the ordered creation from the beginning. Different classes of heavenly servants belong to a universe already structured by divine command. This detail is important because angels will not remain in the background of the story. The heavenly world and the human world will eventually collide. But at creation, everything is still ordered. Everything has its place. The heavens have their inhabitants. The earth has its creatures. Days have their boundaries. Seasons have their purpose. And the Sabbath stands at the conclusion of creation as more than an interruption in human labor. Jubilees presents the Sabbath as something rooted in heavenly reality. Before there is an Israelite nation to keep its sacred rest, already belongs to the architecture of creation. That is one of the fundamental ideas we must understand if we want the rest of the book to make sense. Jubilees repeatedly pushes later covenant practices backward. Things that readers normally associate with Moses and Sinai are presented as though their deepest foundations existed long before Sinai. The argument is subtle but powerful. Moses is not introducing an entirely new sacred order. He is receiving revelation about an order that has been there from the beginning. And that changes the meaning of everything that comes next. Consider the world from the perspective Jubilees is constructing. Human beings may forget. Heaven does not. Empires may change calendars. Heaven does not. Generations may abandon commandments. The order itself remains. The book repeatedly speaks of heavenly tablets, a mysterious concept that will follow us through the story. These tablets are not described as ordinary stone documents stored somewhere above the clouds. They function as a literary and theological image of divine decree, heavenly record, and established order. Events can be written. Judgments can be written. Laws can be written. The course of sacred history can be understood as belonging to something larger than whatever a single generation remembers. This creates one of the deepest tensions in the entire Book of Jubilees. There is an ordered heaven, and there is a rebellious earth. The tragedy of human history is the widening distance between the two. But before rebellion comes creation. Before corruption comes gift. And before judgment comes a world that the text presents as properly ordered. The first humans enter that world. Adam, Eve, Eden. Here again, Jubilees follows Genesis while adding details of its own. The biblical account gives us a garden planted by God, trees pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and a command that establishes a boundary. Jubilees does not abandon that story. It places it inside its larger system of dates, purity, sacred order, and heavenly knowledge. This is a pattern we will see again and again. Jubilees rarely seems satisfied merely to ask what happened. It also asks, where does this event belong in the structure of time? What law does it reveal? What boundary was established? What later practice does this ancient event explain? And what does heaven already know about what humanity is about to do? That final question hangs over Eden, because sacred order does not guarantee human obedience. A command can be given, and a command can be broken. The serpent enters the story, the forbidden fruit is taken, the humans who were placed within ordered creation cross the boundary that had been given to them. Shame follows, judgment follows, exile follows. The garden that should have been humanity's place of life becomes inaccessible. Already the pattern that will dominate much of Jubilees has appeared. God establishes order. A creature crosses a boundary. The violation produces consequences, and history moves farther from what it was meant to be. Yet the story does not end outside Eden. Adam and Eve have children. Cain and Abel come into the world. 2 brothers, 2 offerings, 1 act of violence. Genesis tells the story with disturbing economy. Cain becomes angry. God warns him. Abel is murdered. Blood cries from the ground. Jubilees carries that ancient tragedy into its carefully measured chronology. This matters because the book's numbers create a disturbing contrast. Time is ordered. Human behavior is not. You can divide years perfectly and still fill those years with violence. You can know the boundaries of sacred time and still cross moral boundaries. You can live in a world established by God and still choose rebellion. Cain kills Abel. Death enters a family already living with exile. And generation after generation begins moving across the earth. Children are born, families expand, human civilization develops, knowledge increases. So does corruption. But among those early generations, one name begins to stand apart: Enoch. Genesis says remarkably little about him, yet what it says has fascinated readers for centuries. Enoch walks with God. Then he is no more, because God takes him. No death scene is described, no burial is recorded. No ordinary conclusion appears. A few verses create a mystery enormous enough to generate centuries of interpretation. Jubilees steps directly into that silence. In its retelling, Enoch is not merely remembered as a righteous ancestor. He becomes associated with knowledge writing heavenly signs and the recording of generations. This expansion is important. Later Jewish traditions would develop Enoch into one of the most significant figures connected with heavenly revelation. The Book of Jubilees participates in that wider world of interpretation, but we must resist the temptation to collapse all Enochic traditions into one story. Jubilees is Jubilees. First Enoch is First Enoch. Genesis remains Genesis. They may overlap, they may preserve related traditions, but they do not say exactly the same things. And soon that distinction will become essential, because after Enoch, the story approaches one of the most debated passages in all of Genesis. Genesis chapter 6 describes the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the mysterious Nephilim. The canonical text is brief, almost frustratingly brief. It does not answer every question later readers would ask. Who exactly were the sons of God? What precisely happened? What relationship did the Nephilim have to these unions? How did this episode connect with the violence that filled the earth before the flood? Ancient interpreters did not leave those questions alone. Neither does Jubilees. The book enters the silence and expands it. But before we reach that descent into corruption, remember where our story began. Sinai, a mountain, Moses listening, an angel recounting the history of the world. Creation had been presented as ordered. Heaven had its servants, earth had its inhabitants, time had its divisions, the Sabbath had its place. Humanity had crossed one boundary in Eden, and violence had crossed another boundary in the field where Abel died. But the next rebellion would be different, because this time, according to Jubilees, the violation would not begin only with human beings. It would begin with beings from heaven. And if Jubilees has spent its opening chapters establishing the importance of every creature remaining within the order appointed for it, then what comes next is not merely another sin. It is a rupture between worlds. The heavens had been ordered. The earth had been ordered. The boundaries had been established, and now those who belonged above were about to descend below. The descent begins in the days of Jared. And here the Book of Jubilees introduces a detail that immediately separates its version of the story from many modern retellings. The Watchers do not originally descend because they have already decided to rebel. According to Jubilees, these angels are sent to the earth with a purpose, to instruct humanity and to establish judgment and righteousness among the children of men. That detail matters because it makes what follows more tragic. Their presence on earth begins with a mission associated with order. It ends in the destruction of order. The beings who were meant to teach humanity become participants in humanity's corruption. And between those two moments stands Enoch. Jubilees presents Enoch as an extraordinary figure. Genesis gives us only a few lines about him. He belongs to the seventh generation from Adam through Seth. He becomes the father of Methuselah. He walks with God, and then, without describing an ordinary death, Genesis simply tells us that God takes him. The brevity is striking. Jubilees fills that silence with an entire identity. In its version of the story, Enoch becomes the first among human beings to learn writing, knowledge, and wisdom. He records the signs of heaven. He organizes knowledge concerning months and seasons. He understands the counting of years. That is not a minor expansion. It connects Enoch directly with one of the central concerns of the entire Book of Jubilees. Time must be understood correctly. Enoch is therefore more than a righteous ancestor. He becomes a recorder, a witness, a man who observes the movements of heaven and preserves what he has learned for later generations. Jubilees even presents him as seeing events extending beyond his own lifetime. The past and future appear within the knowledge revealed to him, and he records testimony concerning what humanity will face. The connection is deliberate. Moses stands on Sinai, receiving a written account of sacred history. Enoch, generations before the flood, is also associated with writing and heavenly knowledge. The book is building a chain of revelation. Heaven knows. Selected human beings receive, they record. Later generations forget, and then revelation must confront human corruption again. But Enoch's role becomes darker when the Watchers change. The text says that the Watchers had descended during the days of Jared. They were meant to instruct, yet, as humanity multiplied across the earth, daughters were born to men. And the angels saw them. They desired them. They chose wives. They crossed the boundary between their heavenly calling and human women. Children were born from these unions. Jubilees describes them as giants. At this point, the connection with Genesis chapter 6 becomes unmistakable. Genesis tells us that the sons of God saw that the daughters of humanity were beautiful and took wives from whomever they chose. It then mentions the Nephilim and moves rapidly toward a description of growing human wickedness. But Genesis does not call these beings watchers. It does not give us the elaborate narrative that later Jewish writings would develop. Jubilees does. And this is precisely why the distinction between texts is so important. If someone says Genesis tells us that the watchers were sent down to teach righteousness and later rebelled, that statement goes beyond Genesis. That is Jubilees' interpretation. If someone describes named watcher leaders, a detailed oath sworn on a mountain, and extensive lists of forbidden arts, those details belong especially to traditions preserved in First Enoch, not to the brief account in Genesis. Ancient Jewish texts often interacted with the same biblical mysteries, but they did not always expand them in exactly the same way. Jubilees gives us its own version, and in that version, the sin is devastating, because the watchers violate the very order they were meant to uphold. They leave the proper boundaries of their mission. They unite themselves with human women, and what follows is not portrayed as a private moral failure. The corruption spreads outward, their children become giants, violence increases, the created order itself begins to unravel. The Book of Jubilees describes humanity, animals, birds, and creatures of the earth as corrupting their ways. Blood fills the world. One creature turns against another. Human beings turn against one another. The world is not merely sinful, it is becoming disordered. And this brings us back to the theme established at creation. Every creature had been given its place. Heaven and earth were distinct. Days and seasons were ordered. Human beings had boundaries. Angelic beings had boundaries. The watcher's sin therefore becomes more than forbidden desire. It is an assault on separation itself. A heavenly being reaches across a boundary. The offspring of that union become agents of further violence, and the consequences spread until creation begins to look like the opposite of Genesis chapter 1. At creation, God separates light from darkness, waters above from waters below, sea from dry land, day from night, species according to their kinds, sacred time from ordinary labor. But in the world before the flood, Jubilees describes boundaries collapsing. The heavenly and human realms are improperly mixed. Violence spreads among humanity. The creatures themselves are described as corrupting their order. Blood covers the earth. Creation has not disappeared, but its structure has been violated. And Enoch becomes a witness against the watchers. This is another detail that Genesis does not give us. Jubilees portrays Enoch as testifying concerning their sin with the daughters of men. The man associated with heavenly knowledge now stands against heavenly beings who have misused their place. That contrast is powerful. Enoch receives knowledge and remains a witness. The watchers receive a mission and abandon it. One becomes associated with testimony. The others become associated with transgression. The book eventually portrays Enoch as being taken away from ordinary human society and brought into the Garden of Eden. That is a remarkable development. The garden from which Adam and Eve had been expelled now becomes in Jubilees connected with the preservation of a righteous witness. There, Enoch continues his role as recorder, writing concerning judgment and the wickedness of human generations. Again, this is not something Genesis explains. Genesis tells us that God took Enoch. Jubilees interprets that mysterious statement through a much larger tradition about Enoch's heavenly knowledge and continuing testimony. And his testimony becomes necessary because the world is approaching judgment. The giants are not presented as peaceful wonders from an age of legends. They belong to a world increasingly consumed by violence. Later in Jubilees, Noah will look back on the pre-flood generation and describe a horrifying progression. The watchers violated their appointed order. Their offspring became violent. different groups destroyed one another. Human beings shed blood. Violence spread among the creatures of the earth. The point is not simply that giant beings existed. The point is that the world became saturated with corruption. This is one reason modern fascination with the physical size of the Nephilim can actually distract from the ancient text. People ask, how tall were they? Could archaeological remains prove they existed? Were they responsible for ancient monuments? Did they possess lost technologies? Jubilees is interested in something different. Its concern is moral and cosmic. The question is not primarily how large were the giants. The question is, what happens when beings refuse the boundaries assigned to them? And Jubilees' answer is severe. Disorder produces greater disorder. Violence gives birth to violence. The rebellion of one generation becomes the environment inherited by the next. The same pattern had already appeared with Adam and Eve. A boundary was crossed. Then Cain crossed another. Now the Watchers cross a boundary between heaven and humanity, and the consequences expand across the whole earth. The ancient story is accelerating toward catastrophe. God sees the corruption. Judgment is declared, but Jubilees adds another dimension to that judgment. The Watchers themselves do not escape accountability. The angels who descended and corrupted their mission are condemned. They are stripped of their dominion and bound in the depths of the earth. Their offspring are also marked for destruction. The world they helped corrupt will not be allowed to continue indefinitely. This is where Jubilees again overlaps with traditions also known from First Enoch, although the details and emphasis must not simply be treated as interchangeable. Both works know a tradition in which rebellious heavenly beings are judged and giant offspring are destroyed. But Jubilees compresses that tradition into its own theological structure. The same God who established the order of creation now acts against those who corrupted that order. And yet there is something uncomfortable about this explanation. The Watchers cannot be blamed for everything. Human beings are not portrayed as innocent victims trapped inside an angelic disaster. The earth becomes full of human wickedness as well. People participate. People choose violence. People corrupt their ways. The text echoes the biblical language of Genesis. The thoughts of humanity become continually evil, and the earth is filled with violence. The supernatural rebellion does not erase human responsibility. It intensifies a crisis humanity has already embraced. This balance matters. Jubilees does not tell a story in which evil entered a perfect human civilization only because angels arrived. Eden had already fallen. Cain had already murdered Abel. Human sin was already present. The Watchers magnify the disorder. They do not invent human rebellion from nothing. And in the middle of all this corruption, one household begins to stand apart: Noah. Genesis introduces him against one of the darkest descriptions of humanity in the Bible. The earth is corrupt. Violence fills it. God determines that judgment is coming, but Noah finds favor. Jubilees preserves that contrast and fits Noah into its carefully measured chronology. A world overflowing with disorder now depends upon one family being carried through judgment. Noah does not stop the flood. He does not defeat the giants in battle. He does not overthrow the Watchers through his own power. He obeys. That becomes the dividing line. While the surrounding world repeatedly crosses boundaries, Noah responds to divine instruction. He builds. The ark takes shape. Ancient wood is fitted together, while a civilization continues toward judgment. There is something almost painfully quiet about the image. The giants may seem more impressive. The Watchers may seem more mysterious. Enoch may possess heavenly knowledge. But when the waters come, survival will belong to the man who obeyed the command he received. Jubilees records the construction and entry into the ark, with the same chronological concern that runs through the entire book. The dates matter. The months matter. The years matter. Judgment does not arrive as an undefined mythic disaster. It occupies a place within measured history. Then the heavens open. The fountains of the deep break forth. Water rises. 40 days and 40 nights of rain transform the landscape. Mountains disappear beneath the floodwaters. The boundaries between land and sea collapse beneath judgment. The world of the Watchers, giants, violence, and bloodshed is submerged. For Noah and his family, the ark becomes a tiny enclosed world, floating above the destruction of the old one. Outside are the consequences of corruption. Inside are 8 human lives carrying the future. Noah, his wife, his sons, their wives. The line of humanity narrows almost to a single household. The great civilizations of the pre-flood world vanish from the narrative. The violent offspring vanish. The corruption that seemed unstoppable meets an answer it cannot survive. Water, silence, judgment, and eventually the ark comes to rest. The waters begin to withdraw. Land appears again. A human family steps into a world that has been emptied of the violence that came before. It looks like another beginning, and that comparison is intentional. The first creation emerged as waters were ordered and dry land appeared. Now, after the flood, dry ground emerges once again. Humanity receives another beginning through Noah, but it is not Eden. The people leaving the ark are descendants of Adam. They still carry human weakness. Death still exists. Sin has not been erased from the human heart. The flood has judged a corrupted world. It has not transformed humanity into an entirely different kind of creature. And for Jubilees, there is an even darker problem. The Watchers have been judged. Their giant children have been destroyed. The old world lies beneath the memory of the waters. Yet the supernatural consequences of the rebellion are not finished. Noah will soon discover that something from the age before the flood still reaches into the lives of his descendants. Something unseen, something destructive, something connected in Jubilee's own explanation to the beings that perished before the waters covered the earth. The flood had destroyed their bodies, but it had not ended their story. The bodies were gone, but Jubilees will soon insist that the consequences of the Watchers had not disappeared with them. Before revealing what survived, however, the book pauses over the man standing on the other side of judgment. Noah steps out of the ark into a washed and emptied world. The mountains are visible again. The waters have withdrawn. The animals leave their confinement. Behind Noah lies a civilization that will never return. Before him lies the terrifying responsibility of beginning again. And his first great act is not to build a city, it is to worship. Like Genesis, Jubilees describes Noah offering sacrifice after the flood and receiving the promise that the earth will not again be destroyed by such a deluge. The bow in the cloud becomes the sign of covenant. But Jubilees takes that familiar covenant and places it inside its larger theology of sacred time. The covenant with Noah is connected with the Feast of Weeks, a festival later associated in the Torah with Israel's worship. Jubilees presents the festival as belonging to a much older, heavenly and patriarchal pattern. Once again, something normally encountered later in the biblical story is pushed backward. The argument is becoming impossible to miss. For Jubilees, God's commandments are not arbitrary rules invented when Moses reaches Sinai. They reflect an order older than Sinai, older than Israel, in some cases older than humanity itself. Noah therefore becomes not only the survivor of the flood, but a guardian of covenant memory. He instructs his descendants. He warns them against violence. He emphasizes justice. He commands them not to consume blood. The reason is deeply connected with the catastrophe that has just ended. The pre-flood world had become a world of bloodshed. Life had been treated cheaply. Violence had multiplied until the earth itself was described as corrupted. So the new beginning must be marked by boundaries concerning life. The flood has ended, but Noah knows that the impulses that produced the old world have not vanished. That is perhaps one of the darkest observations in the Noah story. Judgment can remove a violent generation without removing the possibility of violence from the next one. A new world does not automatically create new hearts. Noah's descendants multiply. Shem, Ham, Japheth. Children become grandchildren. Families become clans. Clans begin to occupy territory. Humanity spreads again. And Jubilees records this expansion with the same intense concern for order that has shaped the story from creation. The earth is divided. Lots are assigned among the sons of Noah and their descendants. Boundaries are established. Oaths are sworn. Each family receives its portion. This geographical division is much more elaborate in Jubilees than in Genesis. Some ancient place names are difficult to identify with certainty today, and we should not pretend that every border on Jubilees' map can be reconstructed perfectly on a modern map. But the theological point is clearer. After the chaos of the flood, the world is being ordered again. Families have inheritances. Nations have territories. Boundaries matter. And Noah warns his descendants not to seize land that has been assigned to another. Once more, Jubilees builds order. And once more, human beings will challenge it. There is an especially revealing episode during these generations. A descendant named Cain discovers an inscription connected with the knowledge of earlier generations' teachings Jubilees associates with the Watchers and the observation of heavenly signs. He copies what he finds, and the book says that this becomes sin for him. The detail is brief, but its placement is significant. The flood has erased the visible civilization of the Watchers, yet forbidden knowledge can still be recovered. The old world can reach into the new one through memory, through writing, through knowledge detached from righteousness. That tension is important because Jubilees does not treat all knowledge as evil. Enoch had written, Noah will write. Moses is receiving a written history. The problem is not writing itself. The problem is what kind of knowledge is being preserved, where it comes from, and whether it conforms to the order of God. The same instrument can preserve wisdom or preserve corruption, and then the older darkness returns in a far more terrifying form. The descendants of Noah begin suffering from invisible forces. Jubilees describes unclean demons, misleading them, blinding them, and bringing destruction among them. Noah's sons come to their father. Something is wrong. The flood was supposed to have ended the world of the giants. The Watchers had been judged. Their offspring had died. So what are these spirits? Here Jubilees gives an answer that Genesis does not give. This distinction is essential. Genesis never explains the origin of demons by saying that they are the surviving spirits of dead giants. Jubilees does. Within the worldview of this ancient book, the Watchers are identified as the fathers of the spirits now afflicting Noah's descendants. The physical offspring had died. The spirits remained. And Noah prays. It is one of the most revealing moments in Jubilees. The man who survived the waters does not act as though survival has made him invulnerable. He appeals to God. He remembers the mercy that carried him through judgment. Then he asks that these malignant spirits be restrained so they will not dominate and destroy his descendants. The answer initially appears complete. The spirits are to be bound. The danger seems ready to end. Then another figure enters the story. Mastema. The name will appear repeatedly as Jubilees continues, and we must be careful with him. Modern readers are often tempted to take every hostile supernatural figure from ancient Jewish literature and collapse them into one fully developed picture of Satan. The texts are more complicated than that. Jubilees calls Mastema the chief or prince of the spirits. The term itself is connected with the idea of hostility or enmity, and scholars debate aspects of how the title should be understood. What matters for the narrative is his function. Mastema stands at the head of forces that corrupt, accuse, test, and lead human beings astray. But Jubilees does not present him as a second god fighting the Creator on equal terms. He asks, permission is given or withheld. His spirits operate within limits. That point becomes unmistakable in the scene before us. When the command is given to bind the evil spirits, Mastema petitions that some be allowed to remain under his authority. His argument is chilling. Human wickedness is great, he says in effect, and these spirits serve his work of corruption and leading humanity astray. The request is not granted without restriction. Jubilees says that 9 parts of the spirits are bound in the place of condemnation. 1/10 is permitted to remain under Mastema. This is one of the most famous demonological passages in the entire book, and it completely changes the landscape of the post-flood world. The old giants are dead. The rebellious Watchers are imprisoned, yet evil spiritual activity continues. The new humanity, therefore, inherits more than the consequences of Adam. In Jubilees' interpretation, it also inhabits a world where remnants of the Watcher catastrophe still operate. But Noah is not left defenseless. The angelic narrator says that Noah is taught remedies against the afflictions caused by these spirits. The text associates these remedies with herbs of the earth. Noah writes down what he is taught. Then he gives the writing to his son Shem. Pause over that image. Before the flood, Enoch wrote testimony. After the flood, Noah writes knowledge intended to protect his descendants. Later, Moses receives written revelation on Sinai. Across generations, Jubilees keeps returning to the act of recording. Writing preserves memory against forgetfulness. And forgetfulness is dangerous because every generation seems capable of repeating the corruption of the generation before it. Noah eventually dies. The man who crossed the boundary between 2 worlds, the world before the flood and the world after it, is gone. But his sons continue. Their descendants continue. Nations multiply, and humanity now begins another project. This time, there are no giant offspring towering over the earth. No angels descend to take wives. No floodwaters rise. Instead, ordinary human beings gather together, and they decide to build. The location is Shinar. The project is a city and a tower. Genesis gives us the familiar scene. Humanity shares one language. Peoples settle together. They manufacture bricks. They build upward. They seek to make a name for themselves and resist being scattered over the earth. Jubilees preserves that basic story, but places it precisely within its chronological system. The construction continues year after year. The tower rises. Human cooperation becomes enormous. From the outside, this appears almost like the opposite of the violence before the flood. No giants devouring one another. No blood filling the earth. People are working together. But unity itself is not automatically righteousness. A civilization can cooperate magnificently toward the wrong goal. That is one of Babel's enduring warnings. The question is not simply whether human beings can accomplish something together. The question is what their unity is serving. The same humanity that had been given territories and boundaries now gathers around a monument to its own security and name. The upward movement of Babel creates another contrast with the Watchers. The Watchers descended improperly from heaven toward earth. At Babel, humanity attempts to build upward from earth toward heaven. The exact sins are not identical, but both stories revolve around creatures refusing to remain faithfully within the order given to them. Heaven came down where it should not. Now earth reaches upward in pride, and again judgment answers disorder. God descends to see the city and the tower. Language is confused. Suddenly the greatest strength of the builders becomes their weakness. A command shouted from one side is no longer understood on the other. Coordination fails. The construction stops. The people scatter. Nations separate according to their languages. The city receives the name Babel, associated in the biblical story with the confusion that occurred there. Jubilees adds that a powerful wind throws down the tower. The monument intended to secure human greatness does not survive. Another civilization has attempted to organize life apart from the order of God. Another project has ended in dispersal. And another question emerges. If humanity continually moves from order toward rebellion, how will the story ever change? Consider what has happened since creation. Adam and Eve crossed the boundary of Eden. Cain murdered his brother. The Watchers abandoned their proper place. The giants filled the earth with violence. The flood came. Noah survived. Yet evil spirits remained. The nations received boundaries, yet human beings gathered at Babel. The tower fell. Humanity scattered. Judgment has repeatedly restrained evil. But judgment alone has not created the faithful human family that the story seems to require. The world is filling again with nations, different languages, different territories. Different gods will soon dominate human imagination, and Jubilees is about to turn its attention toward idolatry with increasing intensity. This is where the scope of the story changes. Until now, we have watched the entire human world. Creation concerned everyone. The flood concerned everyone. Babel concerned everyone. But after the nations scatter, the narrative begins to narrow. From humanity to a lineage. From nations to a household. From the world to one man. The family line moves through Shem, through Arpachshad, through generations whose names may seem like nothing more than genealogy to a modern reader. But Jubilees does not see genealogy as empty space. A genealogy is a bridge. It carries memory from one world into another. And somewhere along that line, in a culture increasingly surrounded by idolatry, a child will grow into a man who begins asking dangerous questions about the gods his society worships. He will watch what people bow before. He will look toward the heavens. He will reject the idols around him. His name is Abram, and with him Jubilee will make one of its most important claims. The answer to a world divided at Babel will begin not with another empire, but with a covenant. Abram grows up in a world filled with gods that cannot speak. That is how Jubilees chooses to begin the story of the man through whom the scattered nations will eventually encounter a new covenant. Genesis tells us that Terah fathers Abram, Nahor, and Haran, that Haran dies in Ur of the Chaldeans, and that the family eventually moves toward Canaan before settling in Haran. But Genesis does not describe Abram's childhood rebellion against idols. Jubilees does. And the difference reveals exactly what kind of portrait this ancient author wants to create. Abram looks at the images worshipped by his family and asks a simple question. What good can they actually do? They have no spirit. They cannot speak. They cannot save. They are objects made by human hands. In Jubilees, Abram urges his father Terah to abandon them and worship the God of heaven, the one who gives rain and dew, sustains life, and created all things. Terah's response is one of the most interesting additions in the book. He does not simply defend the idols because he believes in them. He acknowledges that Abram is right, but he is afraid. The people around them worship these gods. To openly oppose them could bring death upon the family. It is an important moment because Jubilees portrays idolatry not merely as an intellectual error, it is a social system. People can continue participating in something they know is false because rejecting it has consequences. Abram does not accept that compromise. According to Jubilees, when he is 60 years old, he rises during the night and sets fire to the house of idols. No one knows who started the fire. Then Haran, Abram's brother, rushes inside, attempting to save the objects being worshipped. The flames consume him. This gives Jubilees an explanation for a detail Genesis leaves unexplained. Genesis simply says that Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth. Jubilees turns that brief notice into a dramatic judgment scene centered on idolatry. Again, we must keep the distinction clear. The burning of the idol house is not recorded in Genesis. It belongs to Jubilees' expanded portrait of Abraham, but it tells us something crucial about the author's purpose. The man who will receive the covenant first becomes a man who rejects false worship. And after the house of idols burns, the family begins moving away from Ur. Terah takes Abram and the others toward Canaan. They stop in Haran. There, Jubilee gives us another scene not found in Genesis. Abram stays awake through the night, observing the stars. At first, the scene might sound as if he is practicing the very celestial divination that later biblical texts condemn. He watches the heavens to understand what the coming year might bring, particularly concerning rain. But then something changes inside him. Abram recognizes the danger. If the signs of the stars alone determined whether rain would fall, then perhaps human beings would be trapped beneath an impersonal celestial system. But Abram turns away from that conclusion. He prays to the Creator. The one who made the heavens is greater than the signs within the heavens. For Jubilees, this distinction is essential. The stars can mark time. They can serve the created order, but they are not gods. They do not rule independently of the Creator. It is a powerful continuation of the battle against idolatry. Abram first rejects carved objects below him. Now he refuses to worship the lights above him. The creation must never replace the Creator. And then the call comes. Abram is told to leave. Leave his country. Leave his kindred. Leave the house of his father. Travel to a land that will be shown to him. The familiar words of Genesis return, but Jubilees places them after years of growing separation between Abram and the idolatrous world around him. His geographical departure now becomes the outward expression of an inward departure that has already begun. He has rejected the gods. Now he must leave the world shaped by them. And Jubilees adds another extraordinary detail. The book says that the language of creation, the Hebrew tongue in the worldview of Jubilees, is restored to Abram so that he can read the books of his ancestors. Whether one accepts the historical assumptions behind that tradition is not the point. The literary purpose is clear. Babel had fragmented human language. Now, as the covenant story begins, Abram is connected again with ancient sacred knowledge. Babel scattered. Abram is called. Babel sought to make a human name. God promises to make Abram's name great. Babel gathered humanity around a city built for self-preservation. Abram leaves the security of his household for a land he does not yet possess. The contrast is difficult to miss. The answer to Babel is not another tower. It is a man walking by promise. Abram travels into Canaan. He builds altars. He calls upon the Lord. Famine drives him toward Egypt. Conflict separates him from Lot. Kings fight across the land. Abram becomes involved in the rescue of his nephew. Many of these episodes closely follow Genesis, but Jubilees continually measures them. The years are counted. The journeys are located within weeks and Jubilees. The promise unfolds within sacred chronology, and eventually that promise becomes covenant. Abram has land before him, but does not yet possess it. He has promises of descendants, but remains without the son through whom those promises can continue. The contradiction grows sharper with age. How can a man become the father of a great people when his own household still lacks the promised heir? Genesis makes this tension central to Abraham's story. Jubilees preserves it. God promises Abram descendants like the stars. Abram believes. The covenant is confirmed. But waiting is difficult. Sarai remains unable to bear children, and, like Genesis Jubilees tells us, that Hagar, Sarai's Egyptian servant, becomes part of the attempt to secure a future. Ishmael is born. Abraham loves him, and the child's existence will never be treated as meaningless. God promises blessing for Ishmael. He will multiply. He will become the father of princes. A great nation will come from him. But Jubilee is relentless about one distinction. The covenant line will pass through another son. A son not yet born. A son promised through Sarah. This becomes unmistakable when the covenant of circumcision is established. Abram's name becomes Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. The promise becomes more specific. Kings will come from Abraham. The land of Canaan is tied to the covenant. Every male in Abraham's household is to be circumcised, and the 8th day receives enormous importance. Here, Jubilees goes beyond simply retelling Genesis 17. It declares that the 8th day requirement is written upon the heavenly tablets. Once again, earthly law is rooted in heavenly order. The author does not present circumcision as a cultural marker Abraham invents. It belongs to a covenant established by God and, in Jubilees theology, inscribed into the structure of sacred reality. This is one of the places where the purpose of the entire book becomes clearer. Why retell Genesis? Why add dates? Why connect patriarchs to practices that later appear in the Torah? Because Jubilees is arguing that Israel's covenant identity did not appear suddenly at Sinai. Sinai reveals and confirms something much older. Abraham is already living inside that sacred order. That is why the book repeatedly places festivals in his life as well. Before Moses gives Israel a festival calendar, Jubilees portrays Abraham celebrating sacred occasions. At one point, he celebrates the first fruits of the grain harvest. Later, after the promise concerning Isaac advances toward fulfillment, Jubilees portrays Abraham celebrating a 7-day festival of joy and living in booths. The book explicitly connects this with what will become the Feast of Tabernacles. Genesis does not say Abraham celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles. Jubilees does, and that difference is one of the clearest windows into the author's theology. The patriarchs are being presented as ancestors who already embody the covenant practices Israel must later keep. Law and history are being fused together. The story does not merely tell Israel where it came from, it tells Israel how it should live. Then the impossible promise becomes flesh. Sarah becomes pregnant. The woman whose laughter had revealed the apparent impossibility of the promise gives birth to a son, Isaac. Laughter. The name itself preserves the memory of what seemed impossible. Jubilees adds that Isaac's name had already been written on the heavenly tablets. Again, history below reflects an order above. Isaac is circumcised on the 8th day. Now the worshipper looks at devastation and asks a question that must have felt almost unbearable. How can the place associated with God's name be destroyed while God remains sovereign? Psalm 74 does not answer by pretending the destruction did not happen. It describes the desecration. Then it turns backward. The worshipper remembers God as king from ancient times. He remembers divine power over chaos. He remembers creation. Hagar enters the wilderness. Water disappears. The child seems close to death. Then divine mercy interrupts the scene. A well is revealed. Ishmael survives. He grows. Jubilees follows the broad direction of Genesis while supplying additional chronological and genealogical details. The message remains complex. Election does not mean that everyone outside the chosen line receives nothing. Ishmael is blessed, but he is not Isaac. The distinction matters because the next test will concern precisely the son through whom the covenant is supposed to continue. By this point, Abraham has already been tested through migration, famine, conflict, waiting, circumcision, the separation from Hagar and Ishmael. But Jubilees now brings Mastema back into the story. The prince, who had been permitted to retain a portion of the spirits after the flood, appears again, and his role here will sound familiar to anyone who knows the opening of the Book of Job. According to Jubilees, voices in heaven testify to Abraham's faithfulness. Mastema responds with a challenge. Abraham loves Isaac. The promised son has become precious to him. Then Mastema proposes a test. Command Abraham to offer Isaac and see whether his obedience remains. Genesis does not mention Mastema in the binding of Isaac. Genesis simply tells us that God tested Abraham. Jubilees places the event inside a larger supernatural courtroom. God knows Abraham's faithfulness. Mastema challenges it. The test proceeds, and then the command comes. Abraham, take your beloved son, Isaac. Go to the high country. Offer him there. Everything in the covenant appears to collapse into that command. The land had been promised. The descendants had been promised. Isaac had been specifically identified as the son through whom the covenant would continue. Now, Abraham is told to place that very son upon an altar. How can promise survive if the promised son dies? The text does not give Abraham a philosophical explanation. He rises early. He prepares the animal for the journey. He takes servants. He takes Isaac. He cuts the wood. They travel for 3 days. The mountain appears in the distance. Then father and son continue alone. Isaac carries the wood. Abraham carries the fire and the knife. And Isaac asks the question that gives the scene its terrible emotional force. Where is the animal for the offering? Abraham answers that God will provide. They continue. An altar is built. Wood is arranged. Isaac is bound. The son whose birth required a miracle now lies upon the place of sacrifice. Abraham reaches for the knife, and Jubilees places 2 supernatural witnesses before the scene, the angelic narrator and Mastema. The test has reached its limit. The command is given, do not harm the boy. Abraham's fear of God has been demonstrated. Isaac lives. A ram becomes the sacrifice. Promise and obedience, which appeared for one terrifying moment to be enemies, are no longer opposed. The covenant continues. But Jubilees does something else with this episode. It connects the timing of the event with sacred festival tradition. The testing of Abraham becomes part of the ancient pattern through which later worship is interpreted. Again, the author's message is not simply, here's what happened to Abraham. It is, here is why Israel's sacred life reaches back into the acts of the patriarchs. This is the logic of Jubilees. Creation explains Sabbath. Noah becomes connected with covenant festival time. Abraham anticipates later sacred observances. Circumcision is written on heavenly tablets. The binding of Isaac becomes part of a calendar of remembrance. The Torah is not floating separately from history. History itself has been arranged to reveal the Torah. Abraham descends from the mountain with Isaac alive. But the story of his household is approaching another transition. Sarah dies. Abraham acquires a burial place in Canaan. It is a small piece of the promised land purchased for the dead before his descendants possess the land for the living. Isaac grows. A wife must be found for him. Rebekah enters the family. Abraham eventually takes another wife, Keturah, and more sons are born. His household expands beyond the one line through which Jubilees believes Israel's covenant identity will continue. And as Abraham approaches death, the book becomes increasingly concerned with inheritance, not merely of land or wealth, but of identity. He instructs his sons. He warns against impurity. He emphasizes circumcision. He warns against taking wives from the daughters of Canaan. He passes on commandments. The older Abraham becomes, the more Jubilees presents him almost like a patriarchal lawgiver. This is not accidental. The man who once walked away from idols now becomes the guardian of a way of life his descendants must preserve. And then something remarkable happens near the end of Abraham's life. Isaac and Ishmael come to their father during the Feast of Weeks. The two sons who had once been separated are again present near the old patriarch. But another figure enters the scene, a younger one, Jacob. Rebekah sends Jacob with first fruits to his grandfather. Isaac also sends gifts through him. Abraham sees the boy, and the focus of the covenant narrows again, from Abraham to Isaac, and now toward Jacob. Jubilees has Abraham bless his grandson with extraordinary intensity. He prays that Jacob and his descendants will become a holy people. He connects the blessings given to himself with blessings reaching backward toward Noah and Adam. The chain is being drawn across the generations. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. History is narrowing toward Israel. But there is a problem. Jacob is not Isaac's only son. His brother Esau stands beside him in the same household. Two brothers, two futures, two lines descending from the same father, and once again a family chosen to carry blessing is about to become a place of conflict. Abraham's journey is ending. The idols of Ur are far behind him. The promised son has survived the altar. The covenant has passed into a new generation. But the next battle will not come from Pharaoh, a foreign king, or a rebellious watcher. It will begin inside Isaac's own home. Because the question is no longer whether Abraham will have a son. The question is, which son of Isaac will carry Abraham's covenant forward? Abraham is gone. The covenant now rests in the household of Isaac. But Isaac has two sons. And from the beginning, Jubilees wants us to understand that these brothers will not simply inherit different possessions. They represent different futures. Esau is the older. Jacob is the younger. According to ordinary expectations, the birthright belongs to Esau. Yet the story begins overturning those expectations before either brother understands how far the consequences will reach. One day Esau returns from the field, exhausted and hungry. Jacob has prepared food. Esau asks for it. Jacob asks for the birthright in return. Genesis preserves the exchange with remarkable brevity. Jubilees follows the same essential event. Esau swears away his birthright and eats. A sacred inheritance is exchanged for immediate hunger. And Jubilees draws the same conclusion as Genesis. Esau despised his birthright. The problem is not that food itself is unimportant. The problem is that Esau treats something lasting as though it were worth less than something temporary. The covenant family has reached another moment where the future turns on how seriously a person values what has been entrusted to him. But the birthright is only the beginning. Esau marries women from Canaan. Genesis says these marriages bring grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Jubilees greatly intensifies the issue. Rebekah calls Jacob and warns him not to follow his brother's example. She urges him to marry from her own extended family, rather than from the daughters of Canaan. Here we encounter one of Jubilees' strongest concerns. The covenant line must remain distinct. Modern readers should be careful with this material. Jubilees reflects ancient concerns about Israelite identity, intermarriage, purity, and covenant boundaries. It should not be transformed into a modern racial theory. The issue within the book is covenant fidelity, and Jubilees wants Jacob to embody it. Jacob tells his mother that Abraham had already warned him about marriage with the women of Canaan. That detail is an expansion beyond Genesis. It creates another chain of instruction Abraham teaches. Rebekah remembers. Jacob obeys. The commandments of one generation become protection for the next. Then Isaac grows old. His eyesight fails. The blessing of the firstborn approaches. Genesis makes the scene morally uncomfortable, and Jubilees does not remove the basic deception. Rebekah hears Isaac preparing to bless Esau. She acts quickly. Jacob is dressed in his brother's clothing. The food is prepared. The younger son enters the tent pretending to be the older. Isaac hears Jacob's voice but touches hands made to feel like Esau's. The blessing is spoken. Grain, wine, dominion, nations, the inheritance of Abraham. And then Esau arrives. Too late. The blessing cannot simply be withdrawn. The household erupts. Esau grieves. Anger hardens into hatred. Jacob's life is now in danger. The family carrying the promise is fractured by deception, favoritism, and rivalry. This is important because Scripture does not present the covenant family as morally flawless, and neither should we. Jacob will become Israel. That does not mean every action he takes is automatically presented as a model of righteousness. The biblical story is often far more honest about its central figures than later retellings of them. Jubilees, however, tends to defend Jacob more strongly than Genesis does. That difference will become increasingly visible. Rebekah now urges Jacob to leave. Isaac sends him toward the family of Laban in Mesopotamia, instructing him to find a wife there. The man who has received the blessing must abandon the very land connected with that blessing. He leaves without an army, without a kingdom, without even a household of his own. Then night falls. Jacob lies down. A stone becomes his resting place, and heaven opens. He sees a stairway or ladder joining earth and heaven with angels ascending and descending. The God of Abraham and Isaac confirms the promise. Land, descendants, blessing, protection, return. For Jacob, the vision changes the landscape. The wilderness is no longer empty. He names the place Bethel, the house of God. But for Jubilees, the moment carries an additional significance. The same book that began with Moses receiving revelation through the angel of the presence now places Jacob beneath an opened heaven. Again, the earthly covenant family is connected to heavenly order. Yet Jacob still has decades of struggle ahead of him. He reaches the household of Laban, and there the deceiver discovers what it is like to be deceived. Jacob loves Rachel. He agrees to serve 7 years for her. The years pass. The wedding comes. But when morning reveals the truth, Leah has been given to him instead. Jacob confronts Laban. Then he agrees to serve again for Rachel. The family begins expanding. Leah bears children. Rachel struggles with barrenness. Bilhah and Zilpah enter the household. More sons are born. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun. Then, after years of waiting, Rachel gives birth to Joseph. The covenant that had once rested in the life of one child, Isaac, has now expanded into a large and complicated family. But numbers do not remove conflict. They multiply the number of relationships through which conflict can spread. Jacob prospers under Laban. His flocks increase. Tension rises. Eventually the command comes to return. So Jacob leaves Mesopotamia with his wives, children, servants, and possessions. Laban pursues him. A confrontation follows. Then a covenant of separation is made between them. Jacob continues toward Canaan, and ahead of him waits the brother he once fled, Esau. Years have passed, but Jacob does not know whether hatred has passed with them. The night before the encounter becomes one of the most mysterious moments in Genesis. Jacob wrestles with a man until daybreak. He is wounded. He refuses to release his opponent without a blessing, and he receives a new name, Israel. Jubilees does not emphasize this wrestling scene in the same extended way Genesis does, which is itself instructive. The author sometimes expands biblical material dramatically, and sometimes compresses what later readers consider central. That reminds us that Jubilees is not merely copying Genesis, it is interpreting Genesis according to its own priorities. Jacob meets Esau. The feared attack does not come. The brothers embrace. For a moment, an old family wound appears to close. But peace with Esau does not mean peace has entered Jacob's entire household. The next crisis comes through his daughter, Dinah. Near Shechem, Dinah is taken by Shechem, the son of Hamor, a local ruler, and sexually violated. The event is grievous in Genesis. It remains grievous in Jubilees. Shechem then wants Dinah as his wife. Hamor approaches Jacob's household, seeking an agreement. The proposal expands beyond one marriage. Let our families intermarry, live among us, trade among us, become one people. To a political leader, this may sound like integration. To the author of Jubilees, it represents a direct threat to covenant separation. Jacob's sons respond deceitfully. They demand circumcision of the men of Shechem. The men agree. Then Simeon and Levi attack the city. Genesis presents the aftermath with unmistakable tension. Jacob condemns what his sons have done because they have endangered the household among the surrounding peoples. And near the end of Jacob's life, Genesis 49 remembers Simeon and Levi's violence with severe language. Jubilees does something startlingly different. It strongly approves the punishment of Shechem. The book uses the episode to condemn intermarriage with outsiders and declares that Levi's action becomes connected with his elevation to priestly status. This is one of the clearest examples of why Jubilees must be read as an ancient interpretation of Scripture rather than quietly substituted for Scripture itself. Genesis gives us one narrative tension. Jubilees resolves that tension according to its own theological concerns, and those concerns are now unmistakable: holiness, separation, priesthood, and the protection of Israel's covenant identity. Jubilees says that Levi is chosen for priestly service. Later, when Jacob returns to Bethel, that theme becomes even stronger. Isaac sees Jacob's sons. He blesses Levi, then Judah. The blessings point toward two institutions that will become central to Israel's later history. From Levi will come priestly service. From Judah will come leadership and kingship. The future of Israel is being projected backward into the patriarchal age. That is exactly the kind of interpretive move Jubilees makes repeatedly. It knows what Israel will later become. Then it rereads the ancestors in light of that future. Levi receives still further distinction. At Bethel, Jubilees says that he dreams he has been ordained along with his descendants to serve as priests before the Most High God. Jacob gives tithes. Levi performs priestly functions. And Jubilees once again invokes the heavenly tablets to establish the practice within sacred order. The author is doing more than explaining why the tribe of Levi later becomes priestly. He is arguing that Levi's priesthood was already anticipated before Sinai. Once again, what appears later in the Torah is rooted earlier in patriarchal history. Then the household experiences another loss. Rachel becomes pregnant again. The journey continues. Labor comes upon her. A second son is born, Benjamin. But Rachel does not survive the birth. Jacob gains a son and loses the woman he had loved from the beginning. The family is becoming the foundation of Israel, but it is being built through grief as well as promise. And the fractures are not finished. Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, commits a grave sexual offense involving Bilhah, his father's concubine. Genesis states the event in only a brief sentence. Jubilees expands it dramatically and uses it to establish warnings concerning incestuous sexual relationships. Again, narrative becomes law. An event in the patriarchal family becomes an explanation for commandments later associated with Israel's holiness. This is one of the defining methods of the book. Jubilees does not allow the patriarchal age to remain merely a collection of family stories. Every crisis can reveal a boundary. Every boundary can reveal a law. Every law can be connected to heaven. Jacob's household now contains 12 sons. The shape of Israel has emerged. But having 12 sons does not yet create 12 tribes united in purpose. One son begins to occupy a dangerous place within the father's affection. Joseph, the firstborn son of Rachel, the child born after Rachel's long barrenness, the boy whose mother is now dead. Genesis tells us that Jacob loves Joseph more than his other sons. That love becomes visible. Joseph receives special treatment, and resentment grows among his brothers. Then come the dreams. Joseph sees sheaves in the field. His brothers' sheaves bow before his. Then he sees the sun, moon, and stars bowing down. The dreams point toward elevation. His family hears them as arrogance. The distance between Joseph and his brothers widens. And this is where the family story begins to become dangerous. The covenant has survived a flood. It has survived Babel. It has survived famine. It has survived the binding of Isaac. It has survived Jacob's exile. It has survived conflict with Esau. But now its greatest immediate threat comes from brothers who eat at the same table. Jubilees even adds military traditions concerning conflicts between Jacob's sons and surrounding Amorite kings, presenting the sons as warriors capable of defending the household. They can defeat enemies outside the family, but strength against outsiders cannot protect them from hatred within. Then Jacob sends his sons to pasture the flocks near Shechem. Joseph remains behind for a time. Eventually his father gives him a simple task. Go, find your brothers, see whether they are well. Bring word back to me. Joseph leaves his father's house. He travels toward Shechem. He searches for the men who already resent him. He is alone. His brothers see him before he reaches them, and in that moment everything changes. The dreamer is approaching. The favored son is approaching. The brother they cannot tolerate is approaching. They look at one another, and a thought that had lived as jealousy becomes something far darker. Joseph left home expecting to return with news about his brothers. Jacob watched his son disappear down the road with no reason to believe this journey would divide their family for years. But Joseph was walking toward men who had already begun asking themselves what would happen if the dreamer never came home. Joseph sees his brothers. His brothers see a problem. And within moments the future of Jacob's family hangs over a pit. They seize him. The special garment that had marked their father's favor is torn away. The dreamer who had seen his family bowing before him is lowered into the ground. At first, some of the brothers consider killing him, but death is replaced by another decision. Joseph will be sold. A caravan of Ishmaelite merchants is passing toward Egypt, and the brothers exchange their own flesh and blood for silver. The son Jacob loved disappears into the distance as a slave. Then comes the deception. A young goat is killed. Joseph's garment is dipped in blood. The brothers send it to their father. Jacob recognizes what belonged to his son and reaches the conclusion they intended him to reach. Joseph is dead. An animal must have torn him apart. The father who once deceived Isaac with a garment is now deceived by his own sons with another garment. But Jubilees adds something that Genesis does not. It gives the day on which Joseph's blood-stained clothing reaches Jacob extraordinary religious significance. According to Jubilees, the news arrives on the 10th day of the 7th month. Jacob mourns, his household mourns, and the book then connects that day with an annual day of affliction and atonement for Israel. The connection is deliberate. The brothers use the blood of a goat to conceal their sin against Joseph. Later in Israel's sacred calendar, the 10th day of the 7th month becomes the Day of Atonement. The canonical Torah establishes that day in Leviticus. But Genesis itself never says that the Day of Atonement exists because Jacob received Joseph's bloody garment on that date. Jubilees makes that connection. Once again, history becomes an explanation for law. A family crime becomes attached to a sacred day. The author is doing what he has done from the beginning, taking institutions known from the Torah and locating their foundations deep within patriarchal history. While Jacob mourns in Canaan, Joseph enters Egypt. He is 17 years old. He owns almost nothing. His family believes him lost. His brothers assume his dreams have been defeated. But the story that looked as though it had ended in a pit begins moving upward. Joseph is sold to Potiphar, an Egyptian official, and Jubilee follows the central movement of Genesis closely here. Joseph prospers. His master recognizes that something about this young Hebrew's work produces success. Responsibility increases. The slave becomes manager of the household. Everything appears to be changing. Then Joseph's integrity becomes the reason for his suffering. Potiphar's wife desires him. She pressures him to sleep with her. Joseph refuses. The refusal is not merely practical, it is moral. He will not betray his master. He will not commit the wrong placed before him. And Jubilees emphasizes Joseph's resistance in a book deeply concerned with sexual boundaries and purity. Then one day the confrontation becomes physical. Joseph escapes. His garment remains behind. For the second time in his life, a garment is used against him. His brothers had used one to convince Jacob that Joseph was dead. Now Potiphar's wife uses another garment to accuse Joseph of an offense he refused to commit. The innocent man is condemned by false evidence. Joseph is sent to prison, from favored son to slave, from trusted servant to prisoner. The dreams of his youth now appear almost cruel. Where is the promised elevation? Where are the bowing sheaves? Where are the sun, moon, and stars? Joseph cannot see the end of his own story, but the text continues, emphasizing that God is with him. Even in prison, responsibility finds him. The keeper of the prison entrusts matters to Joseph. Then 2 officials from Pharaoh's court arrive. A cupbearer, a baker. Both dream. Both are troubled. Joseph interprets their dreams. The interpretations come true. One man is restored, the other is executed. Joseph asks the restored official to remember him, but he is forgotten. The prison door remains closed. 2 more years pass. Then Pharaoh dreams. 7 healthy cows rise from the Nile. 7 starving cows devour them. 7 full heads of grain appear. 7 thin heads consume them. The most powerful man in Egypt wakes, unable to understand what he has seen. His interpreters cannot provide the answer, and suddenly the forgotten prisoner is remembered. Joseph is brought from confinement. He stands before Pharaoh. The slave sold by his brothers is now asked to interpret the dream of a king. Joseph explains that the 2 dreams carry one message. 7 years of extraordinary abundance are coming. Then 7 years of devastating famine. Egypt must prepare before abundance disappears. Store grain. Organize the land. Use the years of plenty to survive the years of hunger. Pharaoh hears more than an interpretation. He hears a strategy. And Joseph is elevated. Jubilees places him at 30 years old when he stands before Pharaoh. A royal ring is placed upon his hand. Fine garments replace prison clothing. A gold chain surrounds his neck. He rides in Pharaoh's second chariot. The prisoner becomes ruler beneath the king. The dreams have begun to turn. But Joseph's brothers are nowhere near Egypt to see it. During the years of abundance, grain fills the storehouses. Joseph marries Asenath, an Egyptian woman identified in Jubilees with the priestly household of Heliopolis. 2 sons are born, Manasseh, Ephraim. Joseph is building a family in the land where he had once arrived alone. At the same time, another crisis unfolds back in Jacob's household. Jubilees pauses the Joseph story to revisit Judah and Tamar. Judah's firstborn dies. Onan also dies after refusing his obligation concerning his brother's line. Tamar is promised Judah's remaining son, Shelah, but the marriage does not take place. She eventually disguises herself. Judah fails to recognize her. He sleeps with her. When her pregnancy becomes known, Judah initially calls for severe punishment. Then Tamar produces the objects Judah himself had given her. Judah recognizes them, and he recognizes his own responsibility. He declares her more righteous than himself. Jubilees again expands the event into a legal lesson discussing sexual boundaries, guilt, repentance, and forgiveness. It even describes Judah receiving assurance of forgiveness after he turns from his wrongdoing. The episode matters to the larger story because Judah is changing. The man who participated in the loss of Joseph will soon face another moment in which the life of a brother is placed in his hands, and this time his choice will be different. Meanwhile, the years of abundance end, the famine begins, the ground fails, Canaan suffers, Egypt has grain, Jacob hears that food can be purchased there and sends his sons south. Benjamin stays behind. 10 brothers travel into Egypt. They enter the presence of the Egyptian official controlling the distribution of grain. They bow. They do not recognize him. Joseph recognizes them immediately. Years earlier, they mocked his dreams. Now, without knowing it, they are acting them out. But Joseph does not reveal himself. Instead, he tests them. He accuses them of being spies. He questions them about their family. They speak of their father. They mention the youngest brother still in Canaan. They speak as though another brother no longer exists. Joseph listens to men discussing the disappearance of Joseph while Joseph is standing directly in front of them. Simeon is detained. The others are ordered to return with Benjamin. Their sacks are filled with grain. Their money is secretly returned. They leave Egypt carrying food, but also carrying fear. Jacob refuses to send Benjamin. He has already lost Joseph, or so he believes. He will not risk Rachel's other son. But famine makes the decision unavoidable. Food disappears. Egypt remains the only path to survival. Reuben offers a desperate guarantee. Jacob refuses him. Then Judah steps forward. He personally guarantees Benjamin's return. The same Judah who once helped send Joseph away now places responsibility for another brother upon himself. Jacob finally agrees. The brothers return to Egypt. Joseph sees Benjamin. His own mother's son is standing before him. Emotion presses against the disguise he has maintained. A feast is prepared. Benjamin receives a larger portion. Then Joseph sets one final test. A silver cup is hidden in Benjamin's sack. The brothers leave. They are pursued. The cup is discovered, and the accusation falls upon Benjamin. The situation is almost perfectly designed to reveal who Joseph's brothers have become. Years earlier, they could rid themselves of Rachel's favored son and return home with a lie. Now they are given another opportunity. They can abandon Benjamin. They can return to Jacob without him. They can repeat the old crime. Judah does not. He approaches Joseph. He speaks about their father. He speaks about Jacob's grief. He explains that the old man's life is bound up with the life of this youngest son. Then Judah offers himself. Let Benjamin go. Keep me instead. The brother who once helped sell Joseph is now willing to become a slave so that another brother can return home. That is the moment Joseph's test has been moving toward. Not merely, do they recognize me, but, are they still the men who sold me? And Judah's answer is no. Joseph can no longer maintain the disguise. He sends the Egyptians from the room. Then he weeps. The ruler of Egypt stands before the men who betrayed him and tells them who he is. Joseph, their brother, alive. The brothers are terrified. The past has returned with authority over their lives. Joseph could avenge the pit, the slavery, the false accusation, the prison. Instead, reconciliation begins. The biblical narrative emphasizes God's providence through human evil. What the brothers intended for harm becomes part of the means by which their family survives famine. Jubilees retains the movement toward reconciliation and preservation. The brothers return to Canaan with astonishing news. Joseph lives. Not only that, Joseph rules in Egypt. Jacob initially cannot believe them. Then he sees the provisions Joseph has sent. Hope enters a house that had lived with grief for years. But another difficult decision remains. To survive, Jacob must leave Canaan, the land of promise, the land where Abraham walked, the land where Isaac lived, the land where Jacob expected his future to unfold. Egypt offers life, but Egypt is not Canaan. Jubilee says Jacob is afraid to go down. Before leaving, he worships. He waits for confirmation. And God speaks to him. Do not fear Egypt. There the family will become a great nation. Jacob goes. The genealogy descends with him. Sons, grandsons, households. 70 persons in the traditional reckoning of the story enter Egypt with Jacob. Joseph travels to meet his father. Years of separation collapse in an embrace. Jacob sees the face of the son he had mourned as dead. Jubilees describes him blessing God for preserving Joseph and preserving all 12 sons. Then the family settles in Goshen. The famine continues. Joseph provides for them. The small covenant family now lives under the protection of Egyptian power. For a time, Egypt is salvation from starvation. That irony will become crucial. The place that saves Israel will become the place that enslaves Israel. Jacob lives 17 years in Egypt, then his life ends. Jubilees says his writings and books are entrusted to Levi, continuing the book's recurring theme that sacred knowledge passes through written transmission. Joseph also grows old. Before his death, he makes Israel's descendants swear that when they eventually leave Egypt, they will carry his bones with them. Joseph does not treat Egypt as the final destination. Even after decades of power there, his burial hope still points toward Canaan. He dies at 110 years old, and with Joseph's death, the protection surrounding his family begins to disappear. Jubilees makes this transition unusually stark. It says that during Joseph's lifetime, the Israelites prospered and that the Egyptians honored them. Then Joseph and his generation die. Political conditions change. Conflict develops between Egypt and Canaan. The borders tighten. A new ruler looks at the growing Israelite population and does not see the family of the man who once saved Egypt from famine. He sees a threat. They are multiplying. What if war comes? What if they join Egypt's enemies? What if they leave? Fear becomes policy. Policy becomes forced labor. Taskmasters are appointed. Israelites build for Pharaoh. The labor becomes harsh, yet oppression produces the opposite of what Egypt intends. The more the people are afflicted, the more they multiply. So Pharaoh escalates. The story that began with one favored son sold into Egypt has become the story of an entire people trapped there. Joseph had entered Egypt as a slave and risen to power. Now Joseph's descendants are being pushed into slavery themselves. Then Pharaoh gives an even darker command. The Hebrew sons are not merely to labor, they are to die. Male infants are to be thrown into the river. And at this point, the framing device of the Book of Jubilees becomes impossible to ignore. Remember who is hearing this story. Moses. On Sinai. The angel is recounting Moses' own ancestry to Moses himself, and now the narrative has finally reached the generation in which he is born. Jubilees says the decree against the Hebrew boys is already in force. Children are being thrown into the Nile. Then a Hebrew woman gives birth to a son. She hides him for 3 months. When concealment can no longer continue, she makes a small vessel, covers it against the water, and places the child among the reeds at the riverbank. The same river Pharaoh has chosen as an instrument of death now carries the child, who will one day stand against Pharaoh's house. Jubilee names Pharaoh's daughter Tharmuth in its retelling. She hears the baby crying. She has compassion. Miriam, the child's sister, watches nearby and offers to find a Hebrew woman to nurse him. And by one of the great reversals of the Exodus story, the child's own mother is brought back to care for the son she had been forced to place upon the river. Later, he enters Pharaoh's household. The threatened Hebrew child is raised inside the world of Egyptian royalty. Jubilees says that his father Amram teaches him writing before he is brought into the royal court. Years pass. Then Moses sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He kills the Egyptian and hides him in the sand. The next day his action is known. The protection of the palace can no longer save him. Moses flees. The child who survived Pharaoh's river becomes a fugitive far from Egypt. Behind him, Israel remains enslaved. Ahead of him lies a wilderness. And somewhere beyond that wilderness stands the mountain from which this entire story is supposedly being revealed to him. Moses has survived Pharaoh. But survival is not yet deliverance. The man who fled Egypt will have to return to Egypt. The fugitive will have to confront a king. And when he does, Jubilees will bring back a force we have already encountered more than once. Mastema. Because the final struggle over Israel's release will not be presented only as a conflict between Moses and Pharaoh. In Jubilees, Egypt's resistance will become part of a larger supernatural conflict. And the night that finally breaks Pharaoh's power will also reveal why this book has been measuring sacred time from the first days of creation. Moses had escaped Egypt once. Now he had to go back. For years, the man raised in Pharaoh's household had lived far from the place where his identity first became dangerous. Egypt had become part of his past. The wilderness had become his refuge. But Israel was still there, still building, still serving, still living beneath a system that had turned fear into slavery and slavery into a policy of death. The canonical book of Exodus gives us the great turning point. God appears to Moses from the burning bush. The ground becomes holy. Moses is commanded to return to Egypt and bring Israel out of bondage. Moses hesitates. Who am I to confront Pharaoh? What if Israel does not believe me? What if I cannot speak well enough? But the mission does not depend upon Moses becoming naturally fearless. He is being sent. Aaron will stand with him. Signs will accompany him. And the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has remembered the covenant. Jubilees moves through much of this material rapidly. Its interest at this stage is not to retell every conversation from Exodus. Instead, it places Moses' return inside the supernatural framework that has followed the story since the days of Noah. And that means Mastema returns, the same hostile figure who asked that part of the evil spirits remain under his authority after the flood, the same figure who appeared in Jubilee's interpretation of Abraham's testing, now opposes Moses as he travels toward Egypt. Jubilees tells Moses directly that the prince Mastema sought to kill him and prevent him from carrying judgment against the Egyptians. This is the book's interpretation of one of the strangest episodes in canonical Exodus. Exodus chapter 4 contains a brief and difficult scene in which the Lord encounters Moses on the journey and seeks to kill him, followed by Zipporah's circumcision of their son. Jubilees does not preserve the episode in exactly the same form. It assigns the hostile action to Mastema. That is a significant interpretive change. And once again it reminds us why the texts must not be blended carelessly. Exodus gives us one difficult account. Jubilees rereads the event within its own supernatural worldview. But Mastema does not stop Moses. The angel of the presence declares that Moses was delivered from his hand. The fugitive continues toward Egypt, and the man who once ran from Pharaoh's authority now returns carrying a command greater than Pharaoh's authority. Let Israel go. The confrontation begins. Pharaoh refuses, and Egypt discovers that the Hebrews it enslaved are not abandoned. The Nile turns to blood. Frogs invade the land. Gnats or lice spread. Swarms descend. Disease strikes livestock. Boils break across bodies. Hail destroys what grows in the fields. Locusts consume what the hail has left. Darkness covers the land, and finally death reaches the firstborn. Jubilees summarizes these as 10 great and terrible judgments, but it also gives them a covenant meaning. These disasters are not presented as random demonstrations of supernatural power. The book connects them directly with what Egypt had done to Israel. Abraham had been told that his descendants would suffer oppression. Now the descendants of Abraham are being brought out. Egypt used power to enslave them. Judgment answers that oppression. Egypt had attempted to destroy Israel's sons. Now Egypt's own firstborn stand beneath judgment. For Jubilees' exodus is covenant memory becoming covenant vengeance. And Mastema does not remain outside the confrontation. Jubilees says that he supports the Egyptian sorcerers. They imitate certain signs. They oppose Moses, but their power is limited.
The book makes a distinction that has appeared throughout its supernatural worldview.
Evil operates, but it does not rule independently. Mastema can resist. Spirits can deceive. Sorcerers can perform what the text regards as harmful works. But none of them stands as an equal opposite to the God of Israel. Their boundaries are determined elsewhere. That same pattern existed after the flood.
Mastema asked.
Only a portion of the spirits remained under him. The same pattern appeared with Abraham. A test was permitted. Its limit was determined. Now in Egypt, Mastema works against Moses, but he cannot reverse the judgment that has already been decreed. That is important because Jubilees is filled with supernatural conflict without becoming a story about two equal divine powers struggling to see who will win. The outcome is never uncertain in that sense. The tension lies elsewhere. Will human beings obey? Will Pharaoh release Israel? Will Israel remember what God has commanded? Will sacred order be followed when the night of deliverance finally arrives? Pharaoh continues resisting, then the final plague approaches, and the pace of the story changes. The conflict is no longer merely happening in Pharaoh's court. It enters individual homes. Israel receives instructions. A lamb is selected. It is killed. Its blood becomes a sign upon the entrances of Israelite houses. The meal is eaten in readiness. This is Passover. And few events matter more to the final chapters of Jubilees. The book has been obsessed with sacred time from creation onward. Now we see why. For Jubilees, Israel must not merely remember that deliverance occurred. Israel must remember when it occurred. The appointed day matters. The appointed month matters. The appointed time of the sacrifice matters. The memory cannot simply be moved whenever convenient. That concern will dominate the closing portion of the book. But first comes the original night. Families remain behind blood-marked doors. Outside Egypt waits in darkness. According to Jubilees 49, the powers associated with Mastema are unleashed against the firstborn of Egypt, while the blood marks the houses that are to be passed over. This supernatural language is an expansion of the canonical Passover account. Exodus centers the judgment in the action of the Lord and speaks of the destroyer in the Passover instructions. Jubilees fits the night more explicitly into its developed world of angelic and hostile powers. Yet even there, those powers cannot cross the boundary established by God. They see the blood. They pass by. The house remains untouched. Once again, a boundary determines the difference between judgment and preservation. That pattern has followed the entire documentary. Eden had a boundary. The Watchers violated a boundary.
Noah survived inside the boundary of the ark. Nations received territorial boundaries. Abraham's descendants received covenant boundaries.
Circumcision marked a boundary of identity. Now on the night of Passover, blood marks the boundary of the house. Outside judgment, inside a meal eaten in expectation of freedom. Then the cries begin. From the palace to the households of ordinary Egyptians, death has entered. The power that had resisted plague after plague finally breaks beneath the cost of its own refusal. Pharaoh summons Moses. Go, take the people, take the flocks, leave. For generations, Egypt had used Israelite bodies to strengthen its kingdom. Now those slaves begin walking out, but Jubilees emphasizes that they do not leave empty-handed. The Israelites receive silver, gold, clothing, and other goods from the Egyptians. The book interprets this as recompense connected with the bondage imposed upon them. There is also another supernatural detail. Jubilees says that Mastema was bound during crucial days surrounding Israel's departure, so that he could not accuse or obstruct them. Again, the text's worldview is consistent. Deliverance is happening simultaneously on visible and invisible levels. A human empire is losing its labor force. A hostile spiritual power is being restrained. A covenant promise is moving toward fulfillment, and a nation that once consisted of one wandering family is beginning to leave Egypt as a people. Think of the distance the story has traveled. Abraham entered Canaan without possessing it. Isaac was born when the promise seemed impossible. Jacob entered Egypt with his sons because famine threatened their survival. Joseph's power saved the household. Then generations passed. Protection became oppression. Hospitality became slavery. A refuge became a prison. Now the direction reverses. Israel is moving out. The people walk away from the land where generations had been born. Behind them lie unfinished buildings, abandoned tasks, and the machinery of an empire that had expected their labor to continue indefinitely. Ahead lies wilderness. No permanent city, no army capable of defeating Egypt, no established kingdom. Only a promise. And almost immediately Pharaoh changes his mind. The departure that seemed permitted becomes intolerable. Chariots are prepared, soldiers mobilize, Egypt pursues. Jubilees again brings Mastema into the action. The hostile prince encourages the pursuit. The Egyptians harden themselves and race after Israel. The people who thought they had escaped now find themselves trapped between military power and water. The scene carries the entire Exodus crisis into one image. Egypt behind, the sea ahead. No ordinary path, no retreat. The people panic. Moses stands before them, and the deliverance that began inside blood-marked houses now reaches its public climax. The sea opens. Israel goes through. Dry ground appears where water should have been. The imagery almost returns us to creation itself. At the beginning, waters were divided and dry land appeared. Now, as Israel is being formed into a covenant people, water separates again. A way exists where no human being could have built one. Jubilees says that the angel of the presence stood between Israel and the Egyptians, while the people were delivered through the sea. The Egyptians follow. Chariots enter. Soldiers enter. The empire that had once thrown Hebrew children into the Nile moves into the waters after the children of those slaves. Then the path closes. Water returns. The pursuing army disappears beneath it, and Jubilees makes the retribution explicit. Egypt had cast Israel's children into the river. Now the Egyptian forces are cast into the sea. The exact enormous numbers given by Jubilees belong to its own retelling and should not be silently treated as numerical data supplied by Exodus. But the theological point is unmistakable. The violence of Egypt has returned upon Egypt.
The oppressor has been judged through the very image of water it once used against the powerless. For Israel, the impossible has happened. They entered the sea with an empire behind them. They emerge with no Egyptian army between them and freedom. This is the event that transforms their identity. They are no longer simply descendants of Abraham living under foreign rule. They are the people brought out of Egypt. That memory will echo through the canonical Bible again and again. Prophets will invoke it. Psalms will celebrate it. Israel's law will appeal to it. Later generations will measure God's faithfulness by remembering the God who brought them out of the house of slavery. And Jubilee does something especially revealing with that memory. It turns immediately from the event to the calendar. The sea has barely closed before the book wants Moses to understand that Passover must never become a vague anniversary. It must occur at its appointed time, every year, on its proper day, according to its proper regulations. Why? Because Jubilees does not separate memory from obedience. If God acted on an appointed day, Israel must remember on an appointed day. Chapter 49, therefore, slows down dramatically. The narrative that just moved through 10 plagues and the destruction of Pharaoh's army now becomes detailed instruction. Observe Passover in the first month. Observe it on the 14th day. Prepare it at the prescribed time. Eat it according to the ordinance. Do not casually move the festival from one day to another. Do not move it from one month to another. The festival belongs to its time. Jubilees says the ordinance is engraved upon the heavenly tablets, and with those words the book connects Passover to the argument that began at creation. Heavenly order existed before Moses. The Sabbath belongs to that order. Circumcision belongs to that order. Covenant festivals belong to that order. And now the night of deliverance is permanently attached to it. This is not merely historical nostalgia. It is a battle over memory. Forget the date, and eventually the meaning can be distorted. Forget the meaning, and eventually the covenant itself can be neglected. For the author of Jubilee's calendar error, therefore, becomes spiritually dangerous. That claim may sound extreme to modern readers, but we are now approaching the key that unlocks much of the entire book. Why did Jubilees count generations so precisely? Why organize history into 7-year weeks and 49-year jubilees? Why connect Noah to festivals? Why portray Abraham celebrating sacred times before Moses? Why place laws on heavenly tablets? Why repeatedly specify months and days when Genesis often does not? Because Jubilees is not merely retelling the past, it is arguing about the present of its own ancient audience. Behind the stories of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses lies a question. Will Israel live according to the order the author believes heaven established, or according to corrupted human calculations? The Exodus makes that question urgent. Israel has been rescued from Pharaoh, but freedom from Egypt is not the same thing as covenant faithfulness. A slave can leave an empire and still carry confusion into the wilderness. A nation can experience miraculous deliverance and still forget. So Jubilees does not end when Pharaoh's army disappears beneath the water. There is one more chapter, and instead of another battle, another patriarch, or another miracle, the final chapter returns to something established in the first days of creation. Sabbath. Years, jubilees, sacred time. The book that began by opening the heavenly tablets is now ready to close by explaining how history itself is supposed to be counted, and that will finally bring us to the mystery surrounding Jubilees beyond its own story. Why did this ancient book insist upon a calendar unlike the one most modern Bible readers know? Why were copies of it preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls? Why did the complete work survive through Ethiopia when it disappeared from much of the Christian world? And after 50 chapters of rewritten Genesis and Exodus,
What exactly should we call this book? Lost scripture? Ancient interpretation? Sectarian calendar? Manifesto? Sacred history? Or something that refuses to fit comfortably into only one category? Israel has escaped Egypt.
But the greatest question about the Book of Jubilees itself is still waiting. The waters of the Red Sea have closed. Pharaoh's army is gone. Israel is free. And yet the Book of Jubilees does not end with the sound of victory. It ends with time, Sabbath, years, festivals, jubilees. The same themes that were waiting for us in the first chapters now return at the end. That is not an accident. To understand why we have to return to the mountain where this entire documentary began. Sinai. Moses stands before God. According to the literary framework of Jubilees, the angel of the presence has been recounting the history of the world to him. Creation, Adam and Eve, Enoch, the Watchers, Noah, Babel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Egypt, Passover, Exodus. Every generation has been placed into a chronology. Every major covenant has been connected with sacred time. Every festival has been presented as more ancient than it first appears in the canonical Torah. And now, at the end of the book, the reader can finally see what the author has been building. Jubilees is not merely saying, remember what God did. It is saying, remember it at the right time. That distinction explains one of the strangest and most important features of the book. Its calendar. Jubilees describes a year of 364 days. That number is not random. 364 divides perfectly by 7, exactly 52 weeks, no remainder. That means the year can be arranged into an unbroken weekly pattern. Festivals can return on consistent days of the week. Sabbaths remain structurally ordered. The calendar becomes mathematically harmonious with the number 7. And 7 has been everywhere in this story. 7 days of creation, the 7th-day Sabbath, weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, jubilee cycles. The architecture of sacred time reflects the architecture of the book itself. The year can also be understood as 4 quarters of 91 days. Each quarter contains 13 complete weeks. Again, the pattern closes perfectly. 7, 13 weeks, 4 quarters, 52 weeks, 364 days. For the author of Jubilees, this is not simply elegant mathematics. It is theological order. The book warns that abandoning the appointed reckoning of the year will cause festivals to drift from their proper seasons. And here the argument becomes polemical. Jubilees strongly resists using the moon as the controlling basis for calculating Israel's sacred year. Its concern is not astronomy for astronomy's sake. It fears that the wrong calendar will produce the wrong festival dates. And if covenant festivals occur at the wrong time, the author believes, Israel has violated an order written in heaven. That is why the calendar matters so intensely. Passover cannot simply occur whenever a community decides that spring has arrived. The Feast of Weeks cannot float freely. The Day of Atonement cannot be detached from its appointed date. Tabernacles cannot be moved without consequence. Sabbath cannot be reduced to personal preference. For Jubilees worship is not only about sincerity, it is also about alignment. Heaven has an order. The faithful community must align with it. This helps explain one of the most repeated images in the entire book, the heavenly tablets. We have encountered them around creation, circumcision, judgment, festivals, priestly identity, Passover, and other commandments. The phrase creates the impression of a cosmic archive in which the order of events and obligations is already established. But we should be cautious about turning this image into a literal map of heaven. Jubilees does not give us a tour of a celestial library filled with physical books that modern explorers could somehow locate. The heavenly tablets function as a declaration of authority. What is written there does not originate in changing human custom. It belongs in the author's theology to the divine order.
This is why Jubilees repeatedly moves laws backward through time. Sabbath reaches back to creation. Festival traditions reach back to Noah and Abraham. Circumcision is embedded in Abraham's covenant and connected with heavenly decree. Levi's priesthood is anticipated generations before Aaron. Patriarchal actions become precedents for later commandments. The author wants Israel to see Torah not as a temporary arrangement invented in the wilderness, but as the earthly expression of something ancient, something cosmic, something already known in heaven. And this reveals why the book can feel so different from Genesis, even when it tells the same stories. Genesis often allows ambiguity to remain. Jubilees often explains. Genesis may leave a date unstated. Jubilees supplies one. Genesis may describe an action without connecting it to a later law. Jubilees makes the connection. Genesis gives Enoch only a few mysterious verses. Jubilees turns him into a recorder of heavenly knowledge. Genesis gives us the strange sons of God and Nephilim passage. Jubilees places it within an expanded Watcher tradition. Genesis says that God tested Abraham. Jubilees introduces Mastema into the background of that test. Exodus contains a mysterious encounter on Moses' journey back to Egypt. Jubilees interprets the hostility through Mastema. A bloodstained garment convinces Jacob that Joseph is dead. Jubilees connects the date of that tragedy with the Day of Atonement. This is not merely repetition, it is interpretation. And that leads to the historical question that has been waiting behind the entire documentary. Who wrote this book? The book itself places its contents in the world of Moses. Its literary voice presents the material as revelation communicated on Sinai. But modern historical scholarship generally does not date the composition of Jubilees to the time of Moses. The work is usually placed in the Second Temple period, centuries later. Many scholars place its composition in the 2nd century before Christ, often somewhere around the middle of that century. That historical setting explains a great deal. Judaism at the time was wrestling with identity. Foreign empires had ruled Judea. Hellenistic culture exerted enormous influence. Questions of Torah observance, priesthood purity, festivals, intermarriage, sacred space, and calendar were not abstract theological exercises. They shaped community life. Read in that environment, Jubilees begins to sound less like an ancient curiosity and more like an argument. Who are God's covenant people? How should they live among the nations? Which calendar should regulate worship? How old are Israel's commandments? What makes Israel distinct? Can accommodation eventually become apostasy? The stories of the patriarchs become answers. Abraham rejects idols. Jacob avoids Canaanite marriage. Levi is elevated. Circumcision is ancient. Festivals precede Sinai. The calendar is rooted in creation. In other words, Jubilees retells the past to address concerns in its own present. And then, many centuries after the book was composed, caves near the Dead Sea transformed modern knowledge of it. Beginning in the 20th century, manuscripts discovered in the Judean desert revealed a remarkable ancient library associated with Qumran. Among those fragments were copies of Jubilees, not a medieval translation, not merely a quotation from a Christian writer, Hebrew manuscripts. This was enormously important. For centuries, the complete Book of Jubilees had been preserved in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia, while portions also survived through other ancient textual traditions. The Qumran discoveries demonstrated directly that Jubilees had circulated in Hebrew in ancient Judaism. The official Dead Sea Scrolls archive today identifies Hebrew manuscripts from several Qumran caves as copies of Jubilees and classifies them among non-biblical, parabiblical compositions. But that modern catalog label should not be misunderstood. It tells us how the archive categorizes the manuscripts today. It does not automatically answer exactly how every ancient reader at Qumran defined Scripture. The idea of a completely fixed biblical canon did not function in every Second Temple Jewish community exactly as later Christian canon lists would. What the manuscript evidence does show is simpler and more secure.
Jubilees mattered there. Numerous copies circulated. Its language, chronology, and ideas existed within the intellectual environment represented by the scrolls, and its calendar was not isolated. Other texts from Qumran also preserve schematic 364-day calendrical systems. That connection is one reason scholars often discuss a broader Jubilees Qumran calendrical tradition. But caution is needed here too. Finding Jubilees at Qumran does not mean that the community wrote it. The text appears to be older than at least some of the surviving copies. Nor does the existence of related 364-day calendars allow us to reconstruct every practical detail with certainty. A 364-day year is beautifully divisible by 7, but the actual solar year is longer than 364 days. That creates an obvious question. How was the calendar kept aligned with the seasons over long periods? Scholars have proposed different solutions. Some have suggested intercalation, periodically adding time to restore alignment. Others have debated whether surviving texts provide enough evidence to show precisely how such adjustment worked in practice. The ancient evidence does not allow us to pretend every problem is solved, and that uncertainty teaches us something important about responsible reading. A mystery does not become less interesting when we admit where the evidence stops. Sometimes it becomes more interesting, because now we are seeing the ancient world rather than replacing it with modern certainty. Jubilees gives us a highly ordered calendar. Qumran gives us related calendrical texts, but the exact history of how different Jewish communities calculated and practiced these calendars remains a subject of scholarship. That is far more compelling than claiming that one secret calendar was deliberately erased from history without evidence. The real history is complicated enough. And then there is another remarkable question. If Jubilees circulated so widely in some ancient Jewish circles, why does the average Christian today know almost nothing about it? The answer leads far from Qumran. As centuries passed, Jubilees did not become part of the biblical canon used by most Jewish or Christian traditions. Its Hebrew text disappeared from ordinary transmission. Much of its Greek form was lost. Only portions survived in Latin and other witnesses. In much of the Christian world, knowledge of the complete book faded, but not everywhere. Far to the south, the text survived in Ethiopia. There in Ge'ez, the complete work was preserved. Its Ethiopian name is commonly rendered Kufale, meaning something like divisions, reflecting the book's concern with the divisions of time. And within the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, Jubilees achieved a status unlike the one it held in most other surviving Christian traditions. It belongs to the Ethiopian scriptural tradition, although scholars caution that Ethiopian concepts and lists of canon have their own complex history and should not simply be forced into later Western categories. That nuance matters. It is fair to say that the Ethiopian tradition preserved and received Jubilees with scriptural authority in a way most churches did not. It is not fair to pretend that all Christians once had Jubilees in exactly the same Bible, and that some later conspiracy universally removed it. The historical evidence does not support that simple story. Different communities received different collections of ancient religious books. Canon developed through complicated historical processes. Some texts became universally influential. Others remained regional. Some disappeared. Some survived in translation. And Jubilees owes its complete survival above all to the Ethiopic textual tradition. That preservation became even more important when modern scholars began recovering and studying the work. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls supplied the extraordinary confirmation that behind the Ethiopic preservation stood an ancient Hebrew text. Two worlds separated by centuries suddenly met. Qumran showed us Jubilees in its early Jewish environment. Ethiopia showed us how the whole book survived. Together, they allow modern readers to encounter a work that could otherwise have been known only in fragments. But what should a Christian viewer do with it? That question deserves a careful answer. If your biblical canon does not include Jubilees, then Jubilees should not be used to secretly rewrite Genesis. When Genesis leaves something unexplained, Jubilees can show us how at least one ancient Jewish author understood the mystery. It cannot make Genesis say what Genesis does not say. When Jubilees tells us that Mastema was involved in the testing of Abraham, we can say Jubilees says this. We cannot say Genesis says this. When Jubilees explains the spirits of dead giants as demons troubling Noah's descendants, we can study that idea as part of ancient Jewish demonology. We should not announce that Genesis explicitly teaches the same explanation. When Jubilees gives precise dates absent from Genesis, those dates reveal the chronological system of Jubilees. They are not automatically historical timestamps certified by Genesis. And when Jubilees places later Torah observances in the lives of patriarchs, we should recognize the theological argument being made. The author is showing that Torah, in his understanding, existed in principle before Sinai. Whether another Jewish or Christian tradition accepts that reconstruction is a separate question. This distinction does not weaken Jubilees. It allows us to appreciate the book for what it actually is. An ancient interpretation can be extraordinarily valuable without pretending to be something else. And Jubilees is valuable for several reasons. It shows how biblical stories were being read in the Second Temple period. It preserves traditions about angels, Enoch, Noah, Mastema, Abraham, Levi, and sacred history that help us understand the world in which later Jewish literature developed. It demonstrates how intensely questions of calendar and festival could matter. It reveals one ancient attempt to solve difficult questions left open by Genesis. It shows how law and narrative could be woven together. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that ancient readers did not experience Genesis as a dead text. They argued with it, expanded it, interpreted it, connected its stories, used it to understand their own generation. The Book of Jubilees is evidence of that living interpretive world. But after 50 chapters, we can now answer the question with which we began. What is this book really trying to do? It is trying to show that the history of Israel did not begin accidentally. For Jubilees, the covenant is not an improvisation. The Sabbath is not an afterthought. Sacred festivals are not arbitrary. The distinction of Israel is not merely political. The law is not disconnected from the patriarchs. History itself has a structure. Creation begins the pattern. Human rebellion violates it. The Watchers violate it. The flood judges violation. Noah restores covenant memory. Babel scatters humanity. Abraham is called out. Isaac carries the promise. Jacob becomes Israel. Levi anticipates priesthood. Joseph preserves the family. Egypt enslaves it. Passover marks its deliverance. Moses stands on Sinai, and the story circles back to where it began. A mountain, a revelation, a record, heavenly tablets. The final chapter returns once more to the Sabbath and the ordering of years. The narrative closes, but the argument remains. Human beings forget. Therefore, sacred memory must be guarded. Human beings corrupt boundaries. Therefore, holiness must be guarded. Human beings alter their practices. Therefore, sacred time must be guarded. That is the theological heartbeat of Jubilees. Not giants, not hidden demons, not forbidden knowledge. Those elements are unforgettable,
but they are not the center. The center is order. The belief that God created an ordered world, that covenant life must reflect that order, and that history becomes corrupted whenever human or heavenly creatures abandon the boundaries established for them. That is why the Watchers matter. They crossed their boundary. That is why Babel matters. Humanity sought its own order. That is why Abraham matters. He leaves idolatry to follow the Creator. That is why Jacob's family matters. Covenant identity must survive from generation to generation. That is why Passover matters. Deliverance must be remembered. And that is why the calendar matters. Memory itself must remain ordered. Whether we agree with every interpretation made by Jubilees is a different question. But once we understand its central vision, the book no longer appears to be a random collection of additions to Genesis. It has a coherent argument. Creation, covenant, separation, sacred time, heavenly order, human faithfulness. And this finally gives us a responsible answer to one of the most common questions surrounding the book. Is Jubilees a lost book of the Bible? The answer depends upon what is meant by the Bible and which religious tradition is being discussed. For most Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox Christians, Jubilees is not part of the biblical canon. Within Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, its status is very different, and it belongs to a broader scriptural heritage preserved there. Historically, the Qumran manuscripts prove that Jubilees is ancient, and that Hebrew copies circulated in Second Temple Judaism. They do not prove that every Jewish community regarded it as scripture. They certainly do not prove that every early Christian Bible once contained it. That distinction should not disappoint us. The real Book of Jubilees is more interesting than the conspiracy version. It does not need invented secrecy to matter. Its Hebrew fragments lay hidden for nearly 2,000 years. Its complete text survived through another ancient Christian culture. Its stories preserve a world of biblical interpretation largely unfamiliar to modern readers. And its central questions remain powerful. What does it mean to remember faithfully? How does one generation preserve what the previous generation received? What happens when sacred identity is slowly reshaped by surrounding culture? What is the relationship between written law and the stories that give that law meaning? And how much can an ancient interpreter add before interpretation begins to look like an entirely new version of the story? Those are questions worth asking. And Jubilees forces us to ask them. So when you return to Genesis after reading this book, something changes. You notice the silences. Genesis says Enoch walked with God. Jubilees asks what he learned. Genesis speaks briefly of the sons of God and the Nephilim. Jubilees asks what their rebellion meant. Genesis tells us Abraham obeyed. Jubilees asks how much Torah Abraham already knew. Genesis tells the story of Jacob's sons. Jubilees searches those stories for the origins of later law. Exodus gives Israel Passover and Sabbath. Jubilees reaches backward and argues that both belong to an order far older than Egypt. Sometimes those answers illuminate the ancient interpretive world. Sometimes they go far beyond the canonical text. Knowing the difference is not an obstacle to understanding Jubilees. It is the beginning of understanding it correctly. And perhaps that is the best way to leave this ancient book. Not by asking whether every mystery has finally been solved. It has not. Not by pretending that Jubilees secretly replaces Genesis. It does not. And not by dismissing it simply because most modern Bibles do not contain it. That would erase an important witness to the religious world that existed between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament era. Instead, read it carefully, compare it carefully, notice what it preserves, notice what it changes, notice what it adds, and when the text moves beyond Genesis, Let Jubilees speak with its own voice, rather than borrowing the authority of another book. If this journey helped you understand the world behind Jubilees, tell us in the comments which ancient biblical mystery or Second Temple text you want explored next. Subscribe to continue this series of complete biblical documentaries, and continue with the next story as we follow another ancient text that shaped the world around the Bible. Because after Watchers, giants, floods, covenants, patriarchs, Egypt, and Exodus, the deepest claim of Jubilees is surprisingly simple.
Human generations may lose the order, but heaven does not forget it.